Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Chris. I'm a software engineer and musician. Today I'll be focusing more on the music side, talking about my journey learning guitar in 3 months, primarily from the perspective of a violinist, and also sharing some tips and tricks I've learned along the way. So first, a little bit more about me and my background just for reference. I've been playing music for well over a decade now, experimenting with violin, piano, and even a bit of French horn at the side. I play violin especially at a pretty high level, competing in many concerto competitions, including some at the national level, and I am still an active player today going through university. But that raises the question, why guitar and why now? Well, over time as my music taste evolved and I started to listen to more math rock, J-rock, or even pop, I wanted to learn some of the riffs that I was listening to, and out of curiosity wanted to compare the difficulty to more traditional violin repertoire. I'd say over the 3 months I spent on average 2 hours a day practicing on days that I was physically able to, and I'll get into that more later in the video. I wanted to show some of my progress so far, so here's my attempt at Ichika Nito's Arpeggio. Now, before I continue, I wanted to give a clear disclaimer that I am by no means a guitar expert. In fact, literally the opposite. 3 months is nothing in the grand scheme of things, and I'm also completely self-taught, so take everything with a very large grain of salt. I'm just sharing some things that I personally found interesting, and some things that I wish I would have known earlier in my journey. So for the first months, I started out with acoustic guitar, learning some basic chords, and playing some songs by Keshi. And the first thing I noticed was just how big it was. Just take a look at a guitar neck and a violin neck side by side. It's more than double the width, and also in the case of an acoustic guitar that I had before, it's thicker as well. Now I have some pretty big hands, especially for violin standards, but this made it much harder to move around the fingerboard as easily as I'm used to. Notably, I was forced to change the angle I approach the strings at. With violin, it's very vertical, but with guitar, I've had much more success with a much more slanted angle. Another big physical challenge was bar chords. Not only is the general hand position pretty much non-existent in violin playing, I also felt I had to press down very heavily along my whole finger or certain notes in a chord wouldn't speak clearly. I actually ended up tearing my skin and developing a pretty big callus for this, which is why there were some days I physically couldn't practice. Now, if you're thinking of picking up guitar and you have relatively smaller hands, don't let this discourage you in any way. I'm sure there are many great guitarists with relatively smaller hands, but I think it's definitely something to keep in mind at the very least. One tip that I have is that you want to play as close to the fret as possible for the cleanest sound. That may or may not be obvious to most people, but I was for some reason drawn to the middle of the fret instead. This is especially important for bar chords though, to limit how much pressure you need to make all the notes speak. Speaking of frets though, that leads me to my next point, which is that frets are a good thing, but also kind of a bad thing. I used to think that it was sort of like a safety net and you can play anywhere in the area and it would just magically be in tune, but that's only partially true. To show this, let me pull up a tuner. Playing close to the fret, we see that the string is almost perfectly in tune, maybe bouncing around just a little bit, but now I'll slide closer to the middle of the fret. Notice how the note is no longer in tune, but actually a bit high. Now ideally, I would just play closer to the fret, but this is sometimes forced. Take this chord from Ichika's song earlier. Frets allow us to create this chord shape, but notice that since certain fingers are forced away from the frets, the resulting chord is noticeably less in tune. Now this is only a difference of a few cents, so it's not a huge deal, but when combined with some accidental pulling of the strings while playing some chords, and this can definitely add up. Frets also limit some flexibility for finer adjustments. The way that string instruments work, even if an open string is in tune, that doesn't actually guarantee that all the upper frets will also be in tune. Now this is definitely something that can be mitigated with a better guitar setup, but nonetheless it's never perfect and it's something I definitely miss being able to do on the fly. Now the thing that I struggled with the most and spent the most time practicing was picking. And coming from violin, this isn't too surprising since one of the most important things in learning violin is learning how to use the bow properly, but I thought it would be easier. And I was wrong. You see, with bowing, the main challenge is getting a really nice sustained sound by varying the pressure of the fingers holding the bow. But for guitar, the tone of the sound isn't really a big concern since we don't sustain the note after we play it. The challenge is actually two completely different things: speed and precision. Playing fast notes is no longer just an issue of fretting the right notes, but also picking every note individually at the same time, which is a much more complex thing to do. Combine this with the precision needed to jump between 6 different strings while picking multiple strings at once using hybrid picking, and this becomes really tough to do well. One thing I wish I knew at the beginning though was that it doesn't actually take much force to pick a note, so holding it down further or holding it at an angle might help. The last thing I wanted to touch on was muting and hammer-ons, because it really shows you just how different the two instruments really are. If you fret a note but not all the way down, it stops the string from vibrating and it mutes the string, which is really useful for getting some nice textures and muting unwanted notes in chords. On the other end of the spectrum, if you hit a note really hard with your finger, this plays the note as if you picked it. This makes it so that you have to be a little bit more careful about your hand placement, even if you're not playing anything, and it adds another layer of complexity as well. Alright, so with that in mind, I'm sure a question that some of you are thinking, is guitar harder or is violin harder? And my answer is that it's kind of an unfair question. I initially thought that the two instruments were similar enough where I could give a clear answer, but in reality, given all the different techniques and the different challenges that each instrument faces, I feel it's unfair. Repertoire, on the other hand, I would have to give it to violin. There isn't much else like playing a concerto, which is very technically demanding for sometimes 30 or even 40 minutes at a time. But as more modern guitarists keep pushing the technical boundaries, I'm sure my opinion will change very soon. So that does it for the video. Even though the 3 months is over, I'll definitely keep playing guitar, but what do you guys think? If there are any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them in the comment section, and I'd really appreciate a like or a subscribe, but otherwise, I'll see you in the next one. Peace.